January 6, 1944. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. Major General Jimmy Doolittle stood in the office of Major General William Kepner, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, when something on the wall caught his eye. Hanging above Kepner's desk was a sign with a simple message. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle read it twice, then turned to Kepner. "That sign needs to come down," he said quietly. "It's wrong." Within hours, a new sign replaced it. "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." That small change marked one of the most important tactical shifts of World War II, a complete reversal of fighter doctrine that would crush the Luftwaffe within weeks. What bomber crews first called suicide and some commanders labeled reckless would soon prove to be the bold move that won air supremacy over Europe. The math of aerial warfare was about to be rewritten, not through new technology but through one general's willingness to abandon tradition for results. The crisis had been building for months. On October 14, 1943, 291 American B-17 bombers launched a second raid on Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. The target was critical, ball-bearing factories essential to the German war machine. The bombers hit their mark with devastating precision, but the cost was staggering. 60 bombers never returned. 17 more were damaged beyond repair. 600 men were killed or missing in a single afternoon. Completing the required 25 missions had become a near impossible task. During the worst months of 1942 and 1943, survival rates dropped to between 25 and 35%. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the famed Memphis Belle, one of the few crews to finish their tour, wrote in his diary that night, "We are being slaughtered. The fighters turn back at the German border and we fly on alone into hell. The forts protect themselves well, but it isn't enough. We need the fighters to go all the way with us, or we need to stop flying." German tactics had become brutally effective. Their fighters formed up just beyond the range of Allied escorts, then attacked in massive waves. Head-on assaults through bomber formations, closing at over 600 miles per hour, left American gunners only seconds to react. Planes armed with 30mm cannons and air-to-air rockets could destroy a B-17 with a single hit. The problem was simple. American escort fighters, the P-38s and P-47 Thunderbolts, didn't have the range to go deep into Germany. Over Schweinfurt, the escorts turned back nearly 300 miles from the target, leaving bombers to fight for their lives against German aircraft that attacked without fear of pursuit. By December 1943, General Henry Hap Arnold, head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, issued a grim ultimatum. Unless the German Air Force was destroyed, Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of Normandy, couldn't move forward. The bombers couldn't keep suffering such losses. Either find a solution or end the campaign. That solution appeared in November 1943, a sleek silver fighter that would change everything, the North American P-51 Mustang. Powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine pushing 1,695 horsepower at war emergency power, the Mustang's performance was astonishing. With external drop tanks, it could escort bombers over 1,600 miles to any target in Germany and back. It cruised at 437 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter. At high altitudes where thin air crippled most engines, the Mustang's two-stage supercharged Merlin thrived. It could reach 41,000 feet and still fight effectively. Long after German Me-109s and FW-190s struggled for power, Captain Chuck Yeager, flying with the 357th Fighter Group, captured its impact in his combat report. "The P-51 is faster, climbs better, and turns tighter than anything the Germans have. For the first time, we have an aircraft that can go anywhere the bombers go, and fight when we get there. This changes everything." But range alone wasn't enough. Victory or defeat would depend on how those fighters were used. Under old doctrine, escorts stayed close to bomber formations, always within sight. If German fighters attacked, escorts engaged them, but only long enough to chase them off before returning to formation. The mission was purely defensive. That defensive mindset had a fatal flaw. German pilots always chose the time and place to attack. They gathered out of sight, dove through bomber formations at top speed, caused chaos, then escaped before American fighters could respond. The escorts never seized the initiative. They only reacted. Major General Ira Eaker, The outgoing 8th Air Force commander had built this doctrine. A bomber pilot himself, he truly believed the bombers' overlapping fields of fire could protect them. Fighters, in his view, were just a backup. Doolittle saw it differently. He wasn't a bomber pilot. He was a fighter pilot, a test pilot, and a racing legend who also held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He understood aircraft performance better than almost anyone, and he understood tactics even more. His famous Tokyo raid on April 18, 1942, 16 B-25s launched from an aircraft carrier to strike Japan, had been daring, technical, and brilliant. He'd earned the Medal of Honor for leading it himself. Now, as commander of the 8th Air Force, he carried General Arnold's direct order: fix the fighter problem. On his first full day in command, January 6, 1944, Doolittle met with General Kepner and gave a new radical order. Fighters would no longer stay defensively close to the bombers. Instead of flying close to the bombers, the fighters would now move ahead of the bomber stream, ranging up to 50 miles forward and 25 miles to either side, actively hunting German aircraft. When the bombers finished their runs and turned for home, the fighters wouldn't escort them back. They would stay behind, sweeping across Germany at low altitude, strafing airfields, destroying parked aircraft, hitting trains and bombing fuel depots. The goal was no longer just to protect the bombers. It was to destroy the Luftwaffe completely. The new order shocked American fighter pilots and terrified bomber crews. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the famed 4th Fighter Group, understood right away. "This is what we've been asking for," he told his men. "Freedom to hunt. We're not shepherds guarding sheep anymore. We're wolves." But Lieutenant Colonel Jim Howard of the 354th Fighter Group saw the fear from the bomber crew's side. "The men flying the forts and liberators think we're abandoning them," he said. "They think leaving them alone to chase Germans is madness. They don't realize that shooting down enemy fighters before they reach the bombers is better protection than fighting them afterward." The crew's fears weren't unreasonable. They had survived missions only because fighters stayed close and drove off attacks. Now those escorts would disappear over the horizon, leaving them feeling exposed and alone. Many believed Doolittle's new order was a death sentence written by a general who didn't understand their war. Whether the plan would work or end in disaster would depend on how the Germans reacted. For the Luftwaffe, the winter of 1943-44 had looked like victory in sight. After 3 years of Allied bombing, German fighter production was actually increasing. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories were rolling out more than 1,000 fighters each month. Their pilots had perfected brutal new tactics. The heavily armed Focke-Wulf 190 Sturmbach variants, equipped with 30mm cannons and underwing pods, could rip a bomber apart with a single burst. These were protected by faster Messerschmitt Bf 109s, whose job was to keep American escorts busy while the Sturmbachs tore through bomber formations. Major General Adolf Galland, commander of Germany's fighter forces, believed they were winning the war of attrition. In November 1943, he reported to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that American losses were unsustainable. "If we maintain this pressure," he wrote, "the Americans will abandon daylight bombing by spring." But Galland's analysis had one fatal flaw. He focused on aircraft production, not pilot losses. Germany was building planes faster than the Allies could destroy them, but they couldn't replace experienced pilots nearly as fast as they were dying. In 1943 alone, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 3,000 fighter pilots killed, wounded, or missing. Training time for replacements was slashed from 250 flight hours to barely 150. Rookie pilots were going into combat with just enough skill to take off and land, but not enough to fight. Feldwebel Hans Dammers, a Bf 109 pilot with 8 victories, wrote to his brother in January 1944, "The new pilots last 3, maybe 4 missions before they're killed. They can't dogfight. They can't fly with their wingmen. They freeze when attacked. We veterans must protect them while also fighting the Americans. It's becoming impossible." Bad weather through early 1944 delayed the test of Doolittle's new tactics. Storms grounded bomber missions for days at a time. But on January 29th, the skies finally cleared. Over 800 bombers lifted off for Frankfurt, and with them the first combat test of Doolittle's new fighter strategy. P-51 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group thundered ahead of the bomber stream at 28,000 feet, flying in loose formations to maximize visibility and reaction time. They weren't tied to any bomber box. Their mission was to find and destroy German fighters before they ever got close. Near Bonn, the Americans spotted a formation of about 50 Messerschmitt 109s climbing to intercept the bombers. Instead of waiting to defend, the Mustangs dove straight in. The German pilots, expecting to attack bombers at their own pace, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against faster, higher, and more agile opponents. The battle lasted just 8 minutes. 13 German fighters were shot down. 2 Mustangs were damaged but made it home. The surviving Germans scattered and never reached the bombers. Colonel Blakesley, leading the 4th Fighter Group on a separate mission that day, described what happened in his report. "We caught 20 Focke-Wulfs forming up over Cologne. They were heavy with ammo and fuel, climbing to attack the bombers. We had speed, altitude, and surprise. It was a slaughter. We downed 11 before the rest could break away. This is how you win a war." The bomber crews flying over Frankfurt that day noticed something incredible. The usual swarms of German fighters never came. A few scattered attacks appeared, but the massive coordinated strikes that had once torn through American formations were gone. The new tactics had intercepted them long before they reached the bombers. But the real test came in February 1944, with Operation Argument, soon known as Big Week. General Karl Spaatz, commander of U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, designed the operation as deliberate bait. The bombers would hit German aircraft factories, targets so vital that the Luftwaffe would have no choice but to throw everything it had into the fight. The objective wasn't just to destroy factories. It was to force a decisive air battle. The Americans now had more fighters, better planes, and superior tactics, and they were ready to grind the Luftwaffe into dust. February 20th, 1944. Clear skies over Germany for the first time in weeks. More than 1,000 American bombers from England and Italy, escorted by hundreds of fighters, took off toward 12 major aircraft production sites, the largest air armada ever assembled. Major Erich Hartmann, Germany's top ace with 352 victories, looked up at the endless American formations and understood instantly what was happening. "This isn't a bombing raid," he told his men. "This is a fighter battle, and the bombers are just the excuse." They wanted the Germans to rise and fight, and the Luftwaffe had no choice but to respond. More than 900 German fighters scrambled to intercept the incoming American formations. The skies over central Germany erupted into the largest air battle in history. Contrails from thousands of planes crisscrossed the heavens from ground level to 40,000 feet. But this time, American fighters weren't chained to bomber formations. They roamed freely across hundreds of miles of German airspace, hunting enemy fighters wherever they appeared. On the ground, taking off, forming up, or moving toward the bombers. The Mustangs and Thunderbolts showed no mercy. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group spotted a formation of Me-262 jets, Germany's new revolutionary aircraft, taking off from an airfield near Leipzig. Deadly in the sky, the jets were helpless while climbing. Drew dove from 30,000 feet, slicing through flak and opening fire on the lead jet as it left the runway. It exploded instantly. He destroyed a second before it could gain speed, and the rest scattered. Drew's after-action report became legend. "The jets are dangerous once airborne, but they still have to take off and land. Catch them there and they burn like any other." The first day of Big Week cost the Americans 21 bombers and 4 fighters. By the standards of the Schweinfurt raid 3 months earlier, that was a miracle. German losses, however, were devastating. Over 50 fighters destroyed and 38 pilots killed or seriously wounded. For the next 5 days, whenever weather allowed, the attacks continued. American bombers hit Regensburg, Brunswick, Schweinfurt again, Gotha, and Augsburg. Each mission sent hundreds of bombers and fighters into the skies. Each one forced the Luftwaffe to respond, and each one cost Germany more pilots and planes it couldn't replace. Major Heinz Baer, a German ace with more than 220 victories, described the hopelessness in his diary. "We shoot down bombers, but fighters are everywhere. We form up and they strike before we can react. We land to refuel and they strafe the airfield. We take off and they're waiting. There's no escape. For every bomber we destroy, we lose 2 fighters and pilots." By February 25th, when Big Week ended, the numbers told the truth. American losses: 226 heavy bombers, 28 escort fighters, about 2,600 casualties. Heavy losses, yes, but American factories and training programs replaced them within a month. German losses were crippling. More than 350 fighters destroyed, 92 damaged to repair, and nearly 100 pilots killed with another 50 seriously wounded. These men averaged 3 years of combat experience. They were irreplaceable. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Ehlefeld, commander of a Jagdgeschwader wing, reported to General Galland, "We're losing our best men. The new pilots can't survive against the Americans. In 3 months we'll have planes, but no one left to fly them." Doolittle's plan went beyond aerial combat. The next phase, low-altitude strafing runs on airfields and infrastructure, proved just as deadly. Each day, as American fighters returned from escort missions, they dropped down to attack anything that moved across Germany. Airfields were hit hardest. Fighters parked in the open, planes under repair, fuel trucks, hangars. Everything became a target. German pilots described returning from missions only to find their home bases under fire, forced to divert or land amid strafing runs. Major Günther Rahl, a Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories, recalled the fear. "We used to feel safe at our own fields. Nowhere is safe. The Americans attack morning, noon, and night. Pilots survive combat only to die on the ground. Mechanics defixing aircraft. Fuel trucks explode. We can't keep fighting under this." By March 1944, the results were clear. The 8th Air Force launched its first major raids on Berlin. On March 6th, 730 bombers and 800 escort fighters struck the German capital. Symbolically and strategically, Berlin was everything. The Luftwaffe had to defend it at all costs. More than 150 German fighters engaged, and the battle stretched across hundreds of miles as the bombers pressed on. When it was over, the U.S. had lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. The Germans lost 160 planes destroyed and another 50 damaged. Nearly 70 of their most experienced pilots were dead or wounded. For the Luftwaffe, it was the breaking point. Captain Johannes Wiese, commander of IJG 52, survived the fight and wrote that evening, "Today I watched the German fighter arm die. We threw everything we had and it wasn't enough. They shot us down faster than we could hit them. Their losses are temporary. Ours are permanent. The war is lost." From January to May 1944, the Luftwaffe bled out. Over 1,000 fighter pilots were killed, wounded, or missing, nearly a quarter of their entire force. The worst losses came among the veterans, the aces, the commanders, the instructors, the backbone of the German fighter arm. They died leading from the front, trying to protect the rookies. They died because they were the boldest, because they led from the front and tried to shield the inexperienced newcomers. 28 German aces with more than 30 kills were lost between January and May. 8 aces with over 100 victories were killed or captured. Each man represented years of training and combat experience. Each was irreplaceable. The training pipeline simply couldn't keep up. In 1944, Germany graduated about 29,000 new fighter pilots, but by mid-year total flight training had fallen to roughly 110 hours, and some late-war pilots logged as little as 50 hours. American pilots in the same period received more than 450 hours of training, including about 250 hours in their combat aircraft. Major Hans Philipp, a German ace with 206 victories, summed it up in a final letter home before he was killed. "The boys arrive at the squadron unable to fly formation properly. They don't understand tactics. They panic under fire. Up against experienced American pilots in superior planes, they survive 1, maybe 2 missions, then they die. We cannot teach them fast enough. There is no time." Production numbers told the rest of the story. In the first 6 months of 1944, American factories turned out over 22,000 fighter aircraft. German industry, even with dispersal efforts, produced about 9,000. The numerical advantage was overwhelming, but the qualitative edge made it decisive. The P-51 Mustang outclassed the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 in most combat situations. Faster, longer range, better high-altitude performance, and as maneuverable or more so in many fights. We have more fighters, better trained pilots, better tactics, and unlimited fuel and ammunition, noted Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group. The Germans have brave men flying good planes they cannot keep supplied or maintained. Courage can't overcome that forever. By April 1944, the transformation was clear. German operational strength, aircraft and pilots, had fallen to less than 60% of January levels. More important, the quality of the force collapsed. The veteran units that had torn up bomber raids in October 1943 no longer existed. The Luftwaffe was increasingly filled with green pilots flying planes with limited fuel, inadequate ammo, and poor maintenance. They faced American formations that grew larger and more confident with every mission. On May 8, 1944, the 8th Air Force sent nearly 900 bombers against oil refineries and rail hubs across Germany, escorted by more than 750 fighters. Not a single German fighter rose to intercept. For the first time, the Luftwaffe conceded the sky without a fight. General Galland reported to Goering that day, "The fighter force is destroyed. We have aircraft but cannot fly them for lack of fuel. We have pilots but most cannot fight effectively. The Americans attack at will. We can no longer contest their air superiority." The strategic impact showed itself painfully on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties that first day. Luftwaffe fighters managed fewer than 300. That gap let Allied ground attack planes and bombers smash German positions and choke off resupply. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel wired home on June 10th. "The enemy has complete air superiority. Our troops cannot move in daylight without being attacked. Supplies cannot reach the front. Without air cover, we cannot hold the beaches." The shift from October 1943 to June 1944 was astonishing. 6 months earlier, the Luftwaffe had looked capable of bleeding the American bombing campaign dry. Now it was effectively gone as a fighting force over Western Europe. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost more than 2,500 fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded over the Reich. Roughly 75% of the fighter pilot force available at the start of the period. American losses were heavy but sustainable. About 420 fighter pilots killed or missing, and some 7,000 bomber crew casualties killed, wounded, or captured. U.S. production and training replaced men and machines far faster than Germany could. Kill ratios had flipped. In October 1943, German fighters were downing American bombers at rates as high as 20-1. By May 1944, American fighters were destroying German fighters at roughly 4-1. Beyond the numbers, the psychology had reversed. German pilots who entered 1944 confident of victory now flew missions expecting to die. American pilots who had worried about German attacks now hunted aggressively. "In January, we were glad when the Germans didn't attack," remembered Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group. "By March, we were disappointed when they ran away. By May, we were frustrated because there were so few left to fight." Doolittle's gamble had been vindicated in full. A tactic many bomber commanders had called reckless had, in fact, saved the strategic bombing campaign. By letting fighters hunt rather than bind themselves to escort boxes, the Allies destroyed more German fighters in 4 months than had fallen in the previous 2 years. The key was allowing fighters to hunt rather than forcing them to defend, General Spaatz later wrote. General Doolittle's decision to unleash his fighters was the decisive factor in winning air superiority. Even some of his earlier opponents admitted it. Major General Frederick Anderson, who had succeeded Eaker in bomber operations, acknowledged his mistake. "I believed keeping fighters close to bombers was the only way to protect them. I was wrong. Killing enemy fighters before they attack is far more effective than killing them while they attack." Doolittle understood that instinctively, and the results proved him right. Before Doolittle's January order, escort fighters were viewed mainly as support for bombers, an added layer of defense. But after Big Week, that perception completely changed. Fighters were no longer seen as backup. They became the main weapon for achieving air superiority, while bombers served partly as bait to draw enemy fighters into battle. This new way of thinking reshaped Air Force doctrine for decades. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, and every conflict that followed built on the same principle. Air superiority is won by taking the fight to the enemy, not by waiting to defend against them. But that strategy came at a heavy price. More than 10,000 American airmen died over Europe in the first half of 1944. Bomber crews kept flying day after day, knowing each mission could be their last. Fighter pilots pushed deep into enemy territory, risking everything to hunt down German aircraft. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, who became the second highest scoring American ace in Europe with 27 victories, reflected years later saying, "We talk about tactics and numbers, but really, thousands of young men climbed into aircraft every day knowing many wouldn't return. We won because we had more courage, more skill, better aircraft, better tactics, and stronger leadership. We won because Jimmy Doolittle understood that protecting bombers meant destroying enemy fighters, not staying close to them. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force had essentially collapsed as an organized defense. Some groups still fought bravely and occasionally scored victories. New jet aircraft like the Me-262 showed incredible potential, but it was too late. The pilot force had been wiped out months earlier. Germany built over 36,000 fighters in 1944, its highest total of the war, but there weren't enough trained pilots to fly them, or enough fuel to train new ones. There weren't enough experienced leaders to shape effective tactics, and there wasn't enough time to recover. Captain Erich Rudorfer, one of the few surviving German aces with over 220 victories, summed it up. By late 1944, we had plenty of aircraft, even jets, but no skilled pilots left to fly them. The Americans had killed all the good ones in the spring. The war was already lost by the time our production peaked. Doolittle's strategy became the blueprint for modern air warfare. Air superiority cannot be achieved defensively. It requires aggressive offensive action that targets enemy aircraft and infrastructure. Technology plays a role, but training matters even more. Numbers matter only when combined with quality. And perhaps most importantly, leadership that's willing to challenge old ideas and take calculated risks can achieve results far beyond cautious improvement. Doolittle's decision to change the sign on Kepner's wall wasn't just symbolic. It represented a complete rethinking of how fighters were used. At first, bomber crews saw Doolittle's tactics as abandonment, but over time they came to understand how it saved them. Technical Sergeant Andy Rooney, a Stars and Stripes reporter who flew bombing missions, wrote in June 1944, "The fighter pilots saved us by leaving us." It sounds contradictory, but it was true. When fighters stayed close, the Germans attacked anyway. When they went out hunting, the Germans couldn't reach the bombers. The best defense was a strong offense. Doolittle understood that, and he was right. By the time of the Normandy invasion, Allied air forces had total control of the skies over Western Europe. German planes still flew, but in such small numbers and with so little effect that they couldn't meaningfully interfere. This air supremacy was crucial to the invasion's success. Soldiers on the ground could fight without fear of enemy aircraft overhead. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, later wrote, "The Air Forces gave us the one thing essential for success. They gave us freedom to operate without enemy air interference." Doolittle's fighter tactics destroyed the Luftwaffe exactly when it mattered most. History now sees this as one of the decisive campaigns of World War II. The change from October 1943 to June 1944 was one of the most dramatic turnarounds in military history. In October, the Luftwaffe was winning, and American bomber losses seemed unsustainable. By June, the Luftwaffe was broken. American bombers flew with minimal losses, and Allied forces were preparing to invade France under complete air cover. Even German commanders couldn't believe how fast it happened. General Adolf Galland later wrote in his memoirs, "When the Americans changed their fighter tactics in January 1944, they won the air war. We could fight the bombers, but we couldn't fight their fighters and bombers together. Once their fighters were free to hunt us, we were doomed. The end was just a matter of time." The statistics proved it. Between January and December 1944, the Luftwaffe lost more than 4,000 fighter pilots killed in action. American and British fighters destroyed over 11,000 German aircraft in the air and on the ground. German pilot training time dropped from 200 hours in 1943 to under 100 by late 1944. American losses during that same period totaled around 750 fighter pilots and 16,000 bomber crew members, but U.S. training. Schools graduated more than 35,000 new pilots, and factories produced over 63,000 military aircraft. The kill ratios told the same story. In 1943, German fighters averaged 1.2 kills for every aircraft they lost. In 1944, American fighters flipped the ratio, scoring 3.7 kills for every loss. By 1945, that number had risen above 7-1. But the most telling figure was pilot experience. In January 1944, the average German fighter pilot had over 200 hours of combat experience. By January 1945, that number had dropped below 50. The Luftwaffe hadn't run out of planes or even fuel. It had run out of trained pilots. Doolittle's bold, controversial decision achieved exactly what General Arnold had demanded. It destroyed the Luftwaffe before the Normandy invasion. It proved that offensive air combat was the key to victory. Protecting bombers wasn't about staying close. It was about eliminating the threat before it could strike. The cost was high. Over 26,000 American airmen died in Europe, but their sacrifice ensured control of the skies, paving the way for victory in World War II. The air war over Europe claimed more American lives than the entire Marine Corps lost in the Pacific. The 8th Air Force alone suffered over 47,000 casualties. These men earned air superiority through courage, skill, and sacrifice. For the German fighter pilots, the campaign was catastrophic. Thousands of young men, many still teenagers, climbed into cockpits knowing they probably wouldn't come back. They fought bravely and skillfully against impossible odds until death finally claimed them. The aces, the veterans, the leaders, almost all were killed or captured. Few survived. Major Erich Hartmann, the war's top ace with 352 victories, survived only because he fought mostly on the Eastern Front. After the war, he admitted what happened in the West. The Americans destroyed the Luftwaffe over Germany in 1944. They had better aircraft, more aircraft, better trained pilots, and superior tactics. We fought bravely, but we were overwhelmed. Doolittle's strategy was brilliant. It cost us everything. In January 1944, when General James Doolittle ordered that sign changed in Kepner's office, many thought he was insane. By June, everyone saw it as genius. The first duty of fighters, Doolittle declared, was to destroy enemy fighters. Everything else followed from that. The Berlin raids, the destruction of German industry, and the protection of ground forces during the invasion all became possible because American fighters had already broken the Luftwaffe in just 4 months of relentless combat. What once seemed reckless turned out to be the only path to victory. 70 years later, military historians still point to Doolittle's January directive as the turning point of the European air war. One order, one shift in tactics, one general's willingness to challenge tradition completely changed the course of history. The bombers came home safely not because fighters stayed close, but because fighters hunted down the enemy before they could strike. The lesson was clear. Offensive action offers better protection than defensive posture. Air forces around the world adopted that principle. Control of the skies comes from destroying the enemy aggressively, not from guarding your own aircraft passively. Lieutenant General James Doolittle retired in 1946 after commanding the 8th, 15th, and 12th Air Forces. He received countless honors, the Medal of Honor, several Distinguished Service Medals, and even honorary knighthood from Britain. Yet, of all his accomplishments, he considered that fighter directive his most important decision. In a 1970s interview, he reflected, "Changing the fighter tactics was the hardest decision I made. Bomber commanders opposed it. Crews feared it. Some fighter pilots thought it was suicide. But I knew from experience that offense wins air battles. You can't win by defending, you win by attacking. The losses were terrible, but they would have been worse if we'd stayed defensive. We won because we accepted risk and attacked." The original sign Doolittle ordered, removed from Kepner's wall in January 1944, now hangs in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Next to it is the replacement sign. Together they tell the story of a tactical revolution that won control of Europe's skies. Many bomber crews who survived the war credited Doolittle's change with saving their lives. At first they believed letting fighters roam ahead was abandonment, but experience proved otherwise. The best way to protect bombers was to destroy the enemy before they could attack. For the Luftwaffe, Doolittle's order marked the beginning of the end. In October 1943, they were winning the air war. 6 months later, they were finished. American numbers, superior technology, better training, and aggressive tactics combined into an unstoppable force. The campaign from January to June 1944 still illustrates timeless military truths. Offensive action beats defensive action when both sides are evenly matched. Superior training produces better results even when outnumbered, and technological advantage combined with tactical innovation creates decisive superiority. Leadership that challenges doctrine and accepts risk achieves strategic success. Above all, true air superiority comes from destroying enemy fighters, not defending friendly bombers. This counterintuitive truth, understood by Doolittle and proven over Germany in 1944, remains the foundation of air combat doctrine worldwide. The story of how one general's order to change a single sign led to the destruction of the Luftwaffe is ultimately about understanding the true nature of air combat. Doolittle realized that fighters are offensive weapons meant to kill enemy fighters. Using them defensively wastes their potential and hands the initiative to the enemy. The bomber crews who once feared his tactics came to appreciate them. The German pilots who faced them learned too late just how effective they were. And the world's air forces learned lessons that shaped warfare for generations. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, when Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy under clear skies free of German aircraft, the success of Doolittle's strategy was complete. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe for 5 years, bombed London, and destroyed entire air forces from Poland to France, was gone. American and British fighters had hunted them to extinction. A single tactical decision, a single change in doctrine, achieved what years of bombing never could. The Luftwaffe was destroyed not by striking factories but by destroying fighters, not by defending bombers but by attacking first, not by playing it safe but by seizing the offensive. The sign came down on January 6, 1944. 6 months later, the Luftwaffe was finished. The connection between those two moments is clear, direct, and undeniable. One general's daring decision destroyed Germany's air force, won air supremacy over Europe, and ensured the success of the invasion that liberated a continent. History now judges Jimmy Doolittle's change in fighter tactics as one of the most important command decisions of World War II, not because it was complex, but because it was right. The first duty of fighters is to destroy enemy fighters.